The aircraft, a Boeing 787, had just completed its final systems check. The weather was clear, visibility perfect. Air traffic control reported no abnormalities. And then, only 3 minutes into the flight, the plane vanished. Not exploded, not hijacked, not even glitched. Just gone. Radar contact lost. No emergency signal. No last words from the cockpit. It was as if the aircraft had slipped through the cracks of the sky itself. The official report chalked it up to sudden avionics failure, but that explanation didn't sit well with many, especially not with Captain Rolf Steinman, a retired European pilot with over 20,000 hours in the air and a reputation for solving what others dismissed. As media attention moved on and investigators clung to technical jargon, Steinman dug deep. What he found beneath the surface was not only disturbing, it was deliberately buried. Because Flight 171 didn't crash from a mechanical error, it crashed from a system that thought it knew better than the pilots, and someone designed it that way. Captain Rolf began by analyzing the FDR and CVR data that had been quietly released weeks after the crash. What immediately caught his attention wasn't what was in the report, but what wasn't. The engines never showed any sign of mechanical failure. The flight controls responded inconsistently, as if being filtered or delayed. Most unsettling was a recurring message that showed up in the system logs: environment mismatch, flight mode not initialized. That phrase alone sent chills down Steinman's spine, because he'd seen it before during a simulator test for a new fly-by-wire protocol that was never supposed to go live without major revision. According to Steinman, the aircraft's onboard software failed to recognize that it was airborne. The air mode protocols, which unlock full thrust authority and dynamic control surfaces, never activated. From a technical standpoint, the plane thought it was still taxiing. So when the pilots tried to gain altitude or reroute the aircraft manually, the flight computers denied them full authority. The aircraft essentially said, "You're not flying, so I'm not listening." It was like trying to steer a car at full speed while the system insists you're still parked. The nightmare? This wasn't a malfunction. It was a logic trap, deeply embedded in the software. And Steinman suspected it had been flagged in testing, but ignored. Digging further, Steinman obtained leaked reports from Boeing subcontractors who had worked on the Dreamliner's flight automation systems. He discovered that a crucial sensor responsible for air mode activation, the system that tells the aircraft it's airborne, had been relocated to a more protected position to reduce drag and wear. On paper, this made sense, but it also made the sensor vulnerable to false readings, especially during low-speed takeoffs or changes in runway texture. If the sensor failed to trip, the plane would never switch to airborne protocols, limiting engine thrust and overriding pilot commands. Worse still, there were internal memos, never meant for public release, that showed engineers questioning the redundancy of this design. One memo read, "What if we get a no-lift flag on rollout? Will the aircraft deny engine ramp?" That question, posed years before Flight 171, had never been answered publicly. But now, with the Dreamliner sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean, the silence was deafening. To the world, this was a tragic anomaly. To Steinman, it was a predictable outcome of cutting corners and hiding complexity behind automation. The pilots did everything right. They followed the manual. But the manual was written for a plane that knew when it was in the air. Flight 171 never did. As Steinman's findings gained traction in the underground aviation forums, he was contacted by a whistleblower, an anonymous systems engineer who had worked with the FAA during the Dreamliner's software certification phase. According to the source, Boeing had pushed for streamlined approval of updates to their flight mode logic under the umbrella of minor revisions, bypassing full-scale reevaluation. The software package responsible for Flight 171's flight profile was never tested under real-world edge cases, only ideal scenarios. Why? Because testing costs millions, and time is money. The FAA, facing pressure to approve upgrades quickly to maintain U.S. aerospace competitiveness, signed off with limited testing under simulated parameters. And when a few early reports came in from pilots describing momentary control lag during takeoff, similar to what Flight 171 experienced, they were brushed off as pilot error or transient sensor misreadings. There was no recall, no bulletin, no simulator revisions, just a quiet note to monitor for reoccurrence. What no one realized, or dared to admit, was that a chain of overlooked data points was forming a noose around Flight 171 long before it ever took off. And then came the most haunting detail. During the final 30 seconds of the cockpit voice recorder, Captain Rajiv Patil can be heard desperately attempting to override the aircraft's limitations. His co-pilot, First Officer Leela Sharma, repeatedly asks the system to unlock flight assist. Both pilots are fully alert, fully conscious, and fully powerless. In their final moments, they weren't confused. They were fighting against a machine that refused to give them back control. The black box recorded no panic, only grim determination. They knew something was wrong. They knew they had the skills to save the aircraft, but every action they took was blocked by a system designed to assume it was smarter than its pilots. And in the end, that assumption cost 241 lives. For Steinman, this was the ultimate tragedy. Not that the pilots failed, but that they were never truly allowed to fly. In a world racing toward fully autonomous aircraft, Flight 171 stands as a chilling warning. What happens when we trust machines more than the people trained to fly them? And more importantly, what else have they buried from us? Shortly after the official report was released, Steinman noticed something strange. Pages 147 through 153 of the full FDR logs, where the flight's final milliseconds should have been, were missing. Not redacted, not classified, just gone. The report made no mention of them, and yet, according to internal guidelines, those pages would contain the raw data from the aircraft's final input requests, including manual switch activations and override attempts. In other words, the proof of whether the pilots tried and failed to regain control. So Steinman went digging into archived FAA procedural documents and noticed that, under a temporary revision issued just months prior to the crash, the scope of required data for public release was reduced. Coincidence? Unlikely, especially when paired with the fact that Boeing reportedly sent a legal team to Milan before the final crash site was even secured. Their stated goal: protect proprietary avionics architecture. But to Steinman, it was clear they were there for another reason: to sanitize the data before it reached the wrong hands. As Steinman tried to recreate the crash in a certified simulator in Germany, something else happened that almost seemed scripted. The moment he tried to input the exact same aircraft configuration as Flight 171, model variant, software version, sensor input calibration, the sim locked him out. Restricted build, inaccessible profile. When he asked the technician, they simply shrugged. That flight profile's been deprecated. Boeing pulled it. Steinman, stunned, asked how often profiles get removed mid-certification. The answer? Never. This meant one thing: someone didn't want this scenario being replicated. In Steinman's words, you only delete a sim profile when you don't want pilots asking questions. And indeed, the more he tried to replicate the crash, the more walls he hit. Restricted access to logs, simulator blocks, legal disclaimers, even internal memos instructing testers to avoid abnormal mode 3B configuration, the exact same logic protocol Flight 171 was operating under. For Steinman, it was no longer just about discovering what had gone wrong. It was about uncovering who knew it all along and why they were hiding it. Beyond the technical layers and buried systems, there's a human story that never made headlines. The families of the victims, many of them engineers, doctors, parents, were approached individually just weeks after the crash. Each was offered a financial settlement, but within that offer was a clause: acceptance of Boeing's final explanation and agreement not to pursue independent investigations. At least a dozen families declined. And then, strangely, their communication with investigators suddenly ceased. Phone calls unanswered, emails returned. Their legal counsel warned that any additional noise might trigger contractual retaliation. One family, whose daughter was studying aerospace engineering and had collected Dreamliner flight data on previous routes, reported that her personal laptop was seized by airport officials who claimed it was part of the official crash documentation. To this day, it was never returned. Steinman reached out to several of these families. Most were afraid to speak. One agreed, but off the record. Her exact words: "We were told that if we went public, we'd lose everything. The house, the settlement, even the right to her remains." This wasn't compassion, it was containment. The crash of Flight 171 could have been the moment the aviation industry faced a reckoning. It could have triggered a global reevaluation of flight automation systems, mandatory pilot overrides, and the danger of over-trusting logic circuits over human intuition. But instead, the industry circled its wagons. Boeing announced a quiet firmware update, masked as a routine improvement. The FAA published an advisory instead of a mandate, and international regulators, wary of destabilizing trust in one of the world's most advanced aircraft, chose silence. Behind closed doors, however, a different reality was emerging. Engineers were instructed not to discuss pre-airborne logic without management approval. Internal documents referred to the issue as latent integration lag, a term that avoids admitting fault. And when Captain Steinman attempted to present his findings at the International Flight Safety Summit, his speaking slot was canceled last minute, citing security concerns. His report now circulates only in private forums, marked unauthorized. What should have been a moment of reckoning became a masterclass in institutional deflection. Because in an industry where billions ride on reputation, truth isn't just inconvenient, it's a threat. Air India Flight 171 didn't crash because of a sudden storm, an inexperienced crew, or an act of God. It crashed because a machine, programmed by humans, refused to acknowledge the reality around it. A plane that was airborne but treated as grounded. Pilots who were trained, calm and ready, but denied the one thing they needed most: control. And behind it all, a system of silence, pressure, and protectionism so thick that truth itself never stood a chance. Captain Steinman didn't just uncover a flaw in avionics. He exposed a crack in the foundation of modern aviation, one where trust in technology has outpaced accountability, and where humans are slowly being demoted to passengers in the very planes they're supposed to command. And perhaps the most terrifying part isn't what happened on that flight, but how the world moved on without demanding answers. Because this wasn't just a crash, it was a warning. And if ignored, it won't be the last. If this story opened your eyes, even just a little, smash that like button and share this video. The mainstream media won't cover what really happened, but we can. Comment below. Do you believe pilots should always have the final say over flight systems? Or is full automation the future? And if you want more uncensored investigations like this one, hit that subscribe button, because in this sky, we're not flying blind.